Without love, the world becomes a tomb. Without love, the world becomes a tomb. The great historian Erich Hobsbawm remembers when his secure world became a world of terror. He was a Jewish orphan living in Berlin, and he walked by a newsstand that had the title on the newspaper, Adolf Hitler appointed Chancellor of Germany. Later, he would reflect and say, it was as if we were all on board the Titanic and we knew we were going to hit the iceberg and go down and sink, but we were all powerless to stop it. So the World War II raged and roared, and the old world order crumbled apart, and the new world order had not yet been formed in the aftermath of that terrible war. He said later again, it was like living between a dead past and a future not yet born. Can you imagine the terror of being a Jew in Berlin during World War II? Often we go to graveyards, to cemeteries, and we pause at the tombstone of loved ones who have gone before. There's something about grief that connects us to a body, to a place. And so Mary Magdalene was as close to where Jesus had last been as she could bring herself, but her world as she knew it had stopped. Her understanding was that Jesus, the source of all love and life for her, was dead. I want to just say a word about, and maybe it's good because it's Mother's Day, about how Jesus treated women. The Gospels are saturated with stories of how Jesus healed women, forgave them, defended them, honored them, engaged them in public conversation in a way that was surprising and defied the status quo. Jesus blessed women. Think of how he was best friends with Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, or how he engaged the woman at the well in conversation and then transformed her life by telling her her whole life story. Remember when he defended the honor of a woman caught in adultery before her accusers? Remember when a woman just touched the hem of his garment and he knew that his healing power had gone out? Or when he stopped the funeral procession and raised the widow of Nain's son from the dead and gave him back? Or the tender grace that Jesus showed to the woman who came to the dinner at a Pharisee's house and wept unashamedly at his feet because of his forgiveness and love. Jesus also, in a time that was a man's world, Jesus called women to be his disciples, to be his followers. And he's still calling today. So there's something about Mary. Let's talk about Mary Magdalene. What do we know about her? In a time when women couldn't be a witness in a legal case, in a time where women couldn't own property, in a time where they were treated like second-class citizens, Jesus had a great relationship with Mary Magdalene. In John's gospel, Mary was depicted as standing at the foot of the cross, even when all the other disciples had deserted him. Mary of Magdala was there courageously, one of the first to attend to his body, preparing him for burial, one of the first to the tomb, and one of the first witnesses to his resurrection. Here she is meeting him in the garden. A little history. Magdalene wasn't her surname, but Magdala was a fishing village on the west shore of the Sea of Galilee in northern Israel. Historians tell us that she was a wealthy woman of nobility and that she provided for Jesus Christ and their disciples as they journeyed in their ministry for 3 years. Luke 8 tells us that Mary Magdalene had been freed by Jesus from being possessed by 7 demonic spirits. So Jesus swept her clean, and her body then became the temple of the Spirit of the Lord Jesus. Exorcism then for her was not a black mark, rather it was a qualifier for her to become one of the greatest evangelists. She was equal to any of the apostles, historians tell us. So then we understand how her grief would be so profound when she stood outside the tomb weeping in the Easter garden. Her whole world had changed when Jesus died. Her grief was intimate. The world had stopped because her future now was changed. Her perception was that Jesus, the Son of God, was dead, and her dreams had died with him. The one who loved her unconditionally without expecting anything in return was gone. She thought that someone had taken his body away. So the angels ask her this question, "Why are you weeping?" And maybe that's a good question for any of us. What is it that causes us to be sad? When we weep, why do we weep? What do we lament? What causes us to fight a cloud of despair? Mary's grief changed her perception of truth. The tragedy had caused her grief to affect her ability to understand and perceive accurately. It does that for us too. Grief distorts our ability to accurately assess life. Why are you weeping? She wept because Jesus, her lover, her Lord, was gone. However, the truth was he stood right before her, asking that same question, "Why are you weeping?" Many of us weep for a whole variety of reasons. I remember a man named Peter. His wife Wendy called me. Peter was in mid-January sitting on the front step of his house in Rochester, Minnesota. It was 20 below. He was a well-regarded, respected physician, research physician. But Wendy and Pete's son in the last month had died of sudden infant death syndrome. And all his scientific knowledge, all of his ability as a physician was powerless to save his son. There's couples often who contact me where they've made mistakes. The wounds are deep. Trust has been ripped up. And they don't know how to, even though they want to make it work and they want to reconcile and they want to rebuild their marriage, it's hard to find a pattern of relationship that works. I remember a phone call I received from a man in a former parish. He was desperate. He said, "Pastor, I've drunk a bunch of whiskey today. I'm scared. I'm so scared." He remembered former times where, despite his struggle with alcohol, I had welcomed him and we had prayed for God's forgiveness and we'd prayed for the Spirit to deliver him from the bondage he felt to this addiction. He said to me, "I can't see Jesus. I can't find him. I can't feel him. They've taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they've laid him." He said, "Friends from a different church tell me that my faith isn't strong enough or I must not be sincere enough. I'm scared, Pastor." Then a family of 4 on another occasion comes to my office, and they're hurried and harried by their life. All 4 of them so immersed in life in ways that are like a guinea pig on a treadmill. And they're so out of control, they don't know how to fix it. All of them, all of those examples I just gave, they wonder, what difference does it make that Jesus is raised from the dead? And how does the power of Jesus heal and transform and deliver us to emerge to new patterns of relating? How do we move out of grief and despair or bondage or guilt or misguided choices to new life? Without love, the world becomes a tomb. But it all changed when Jesus looked at Mary and called her by name. That cut through her despair and her sadness. Mary, he said. And her eyes were opened to recognize that Jesus was risen from the dead, that he stood before her. And immediately her grief became great joy. What difference does it make that Jesus is risen? It means that we're never alone. We're never abandoned. We're never rejected. Jesus, in fact, says to you again today, child, I forgive you. And that Jesus is raised from the dead to love us on our journey of life always. There's a story about a boy who was flying a kite, and the man walking down the street saw the boy flying the kite, and he perceived that something was a little different about how the boy walked as he flew his kite. And he walked up to the boy and he said, "Do you like flying your kite?" "Oh, yes, sir," he said. "Well, how is that?" he said. He perceived that he was blind. "How is that?" he said, "since you can't see it?" And the boy smiled ear to ear and he said, "But I can feel the kite tugging on the string up in the wind." We can't see Jesus with our physical eyes, but by the promise of his word and by the stirring of the spirit wind, we can feel his love tugging on our hearts. Without love, the world becomes a tomb, but when Jesus comes to us, he calls us by name. He knows us personally and intimately. Yesterday, when our men's group gathered by phone conference to do our Saturday morning Bible study, Steve Quattlebaum told a story about when the pastor of Bethany, Tom Detmer, talked about going with his wife Becky to a Clay County Fair concert with Garth Brooks, and how Garth Brooks walked out on the stage with those thousands of people and said, "I love you all, Spencer, Iowa." But then Detmer said to his people listening to his message, "But what if instead Garth Brooks had walked out on stage, closed his eyes, and said, 'I love you, Becky Detmer'?" It's an entirely different message. We can say God loves the world, but then to know that Jesus, who knew you when you were in a mother's womb, still knows you personally. And he comes to where you are as you are and calls you by name. Don't be afraid. I've redeemed you. I've called you by name. You belong to me. That's what Pete read from Isaiah 43 earlier. So years ago, I read a book by Norman Vincent Peale, and he told a story about a British violinist named Peter Cropper. Cropper's violin ability was so outstanding that the Royal Academy of Music in London honored him by lending him a priceless 258-year-old Stradivarius. Is the dream of every violinist, every musician, to play an instrument like that. While he was performing in Finland, Peter Cropper had a terrible accident happen. He tripped coming onto stage, and he fell on top of the Stradivarius violin, and it broke. His pleasant dream all of a sudden became a terrible nightmare. And then a London violin dealer told him about a master craftsman who could repair the Stradivarius. And when the master craftsman was done, the repairs were so beautiful and detailed, the restoration so flawless, you couldn't even see that it had been broken. And when Cropper took it in his hands and played it again, it was as beautiful as ever. So wherever you and I might experience brokenness or struggle or pain, we bring it to the Master who calls us by name. We give the broken pieces of our life to Him, and when He is done, He invites us to come touch His hands, feel His side. He invites us to know He's alive for us, to love us. And in His love we're healed, and then our lives become used by Him to play the beautiful song of hope that can change the world. So Jesus comes to you today and calls you by name.